as electricity demand increases, virtual power plants might be the answer. Pippa Stevens is here now with more. Pippa, this is a new one for me. Virtual power plants. I'm trying to wrap my head around what that even means.
Yeah, so essentially the grid is facing a host of challenges. As you said, electricity demand is rising, and then intermittent sources like solar can't just ramp up when we need it. And that's where virtual power plants come in. At the simplest, it's a collection of thousands of smart devices. Think panels, home batteries, thermostats, EVs, that when grouped together can help the grid by either providing a power bank or reducing demand at peak times. There are benefits for both the customer and the utility. First is just a more reliable grid. Blackouts have surged 64% over the last decade, costing some $150 billion annually, and VPPs can help utilities load shift. They also cut emissions and reduce costs. The utility might not have to build a gas peaker plant, and the customer gets a credit for power supplied to the grid. Now, there are multiple stakeholders here, including residential battery installers like Sunrun, Sonova, or Enphase, grid services companies like Itron and STEM, and then utilities themselves that are adopting these programs, including Edison International and National Grid. So this really is a story about power in numbers.
What does it mean for the overall costs?
So essentially, it reduces costs for both the utility and the customers, because utilities always have to have generation to match demand. And so there are things called gas peaker plants, which only fire up. It can be only a couple of hours per year, but it has to be there as a resource, as a resource should demand surge. And so if the utility has a VPP, they might not have to build that gas peaker plant because they can call on customers to reduce their demand rather than ramping up supply to match, demand that could be at an all-time high unnecessarily.
But how does it work? The residential customer buys the battery or the generator or whatever the devices are that are going to feed into the grid, and then the utility goes to them and says, hey, we know that you bought this. We'd like to have you as part of the grid.
So customers opt into these programs, and a lot of the time utilities will incentivize it by providing something like a smart thermostat. So think about it if, let's say thousands of customers, thousands of homes are lowered by 1 degree. That starts to have a very meaningful
impact. Do they lower it or do you lower it?
The utility lowers it, but you can always opt out.
Do they control my thermostat?
No. You opt in, and you can always choose to opt out. So another thing is like charging your electric vehicle. Maybe you want to charge it at peak times when you get home from work, but everybody's tapping into the grid at that moment, so power prices are higher. So you can say to your utility, hey, you can charge it at a time maybe 2 a.m. when there's not a lot of demand on the grid, but you can always opt out. There's always the option to say, hey, actually, I do want to charge my EV at this time. But you get a credit, and sometimes you actually get paid directly for the power saved.
How reliable is this? I think of anything that is more in my control as being a little scarier in terms of reliability. Is it? Well, is it as functional as the old way of doing this?
Yes, and so ultimately it's here to help grid reliability, because the idea is that the grid is changing with more distributed energy resources. There's no longer this constant supply and demand. We're not ramping up fossil fuels to meet demand. The grid of yesteryear was built to always have that match, and today it's different. Customers are generating their own power. And so ultimately, if the utility can tap into your battery and be smart about it, then they might not have to implement things like rolling blackouts, because they're tapping into a customer's battery in one area and then shifting the power.
Maybe the most striking thing in your report, that blackouts are up 64%. At a time when we require the grid to be more and more reliable, it's getting less and less reliable. That's pretty outrageous.
Yeah, it's really hard to manage.
Something's wrong.
Costs are going up. Electricity demand is going up. I mean,
climate risk is real, and that there is always the potential for a cyber attack that takes down the grid. And that's, in the insurance space, this is something
we don't need terrorists to take down the grid. We take it down ourselves. Yeah. With a 64% increase in blackouts.
People are tapping the grid a lot, and it's a very different grid. It's no longer the centralized behemoth. Now, when you have all these devices, when you have EVs going around, you have heat pumps. There's just so much more demand and different types of demand for a grid that was built a century ago.
Pippa, thank you very much.